Welcome back to London Gritty Chronicles. Imagine Europe in the early 1300s. It is not a silent, empty place. It is teeming with life. It is running out of space. For 3 centuries, the population had exploded. Forests were cleared to make way for farmland. Towns were bursting past their old Roman walls. It was a world operating at its absolute limit. In historical terms, we call this a period of high medieval demographic pressure. Demographic relates to the structure of populations. The streets of Paris and Florence were incredibly dense, packed with humanity, noise, and commerce. It was a vibrant, precarious world, perched on a knife edge between prosperity and starvation. And then, the silence began. Our story begins not with a bang, but with the creak of ropes at a dockside. We need to look closely at a specific moment. History often pivots on these small, seemingly normal events that unleash massive consequences. Listen for the phrase, a pivotal moment. This is useful academic English. It means a crucial point in time where things change significantly. October, the year of our Lord 1347. The port of Messina on the island of Sicily. The harbor water is calm. The morning sun is burning off the Mediterranean mist. Dock workers stop their conversations as they see sails on the horizon. They recognize the flags. These are Genoese merchant ships returning from the Black Sea. Normally, this is cause for celebration. These ships bring silk, spices, and news from the distant east. The merchants of Messina prepare their coin purses. The dockhands prepare their backs for heavy lifting. As the first galley glides toward the stone quay, something is wrong. The ship is strangely quiet. There are 2 fusaders on deck. The men who are visible move sluggishly, staggering as they throw the mooring ropes to the people on shore. When the Messina authorities board the vessels, they are met with a horror that defies their medieval understanding. Most of the sailors are dead below decks. The few who are alive are delirious with fever, their bodies covered in black, painful swellings. They are coughing blood. The harbour masters, terrified, immediately order the ships to leave. They demand they cut their ropes and return to the open sea. But it is too late. The transaction has already happened. The ropes were handled. The breath was shared. And crucial stowaways have already scurried down the gangplanks and into the dark corners of the Sicilian port. This is the accidental twist. A routine commercial arrival that delivers an apocalypse. What landed in Messina that day, and soon after in Genoa, Venice, and Marseille, was Yersinia pestis. Today, we know this as the bacterium responsible for the plague. Back then, it had no name. It was simply the mortality, or later, the Great Pestilence. In this documentary, we are going to attempt a difficult historical exercise. We're going to practice synthesis. Synthesis is a vital skill for advanced English learners. It means combining separate elements or ideas to form a coherent whole. We are not just going to look at the death toll. We are going to synthesize 4 different historical threads: labor shifts, urban growth, changing religious beliefs, and the birth of public health. We will connect these disparate elements to argue a single thesis: that this catastrophe, this massive trauma, was the violent engine that pushed Europe out of the Middle Ages and onto the path toward modernity. How does a microscopic bacterium rewire an entire continent's economic system? How does mass death lead to a rebirth of cities? To understand the transformation, we must first understand the mechanism of the terror itself. The invisible passenger that disembarked in Messina was about to exploit the very strengths of medieval Europe, its trade routes and its crowded cities. The trap was set. The ropes at the Messina dock were just the beginning. The ships were expelled, but the invisible cargo had already found a new home. It moved from the damp holds of the galleys into the bustling streets of Sicily, and from there to the mainland of Europe. To understand the massive societal shifts that followed, we must first look at the biology. We need to understand the mechanism of the killer. This is the biology to society mirror. The microscopic actions inside the body were about to be reflected in macroscopic actions across the continent. Macroscopic means visible to the naked eye, huge scale. Medieval Europeans did not understand bacteria. Their best doctors, steeped in ancient Greek theories, believed the air itself had become corrupted. They called it miasma, a poisonous mist rising from the earth or sea. They were tragically wrong. The danger wasn't the air. It was the passengers. The primary culprit was the rat flea. These tiny insects carried Yersinia pestis in their guts. The bacteria would block the flea's stomach, making it ravenously hungry. The starving flea would jump onto a host, usually a black rat, which was terrifyingly common in medieval cities, and bite repeatedly, regurgitating bacteria into the wound. When the rats died, the fleas got desperate. They jumped to the next available warm body: humans. In historical English, we call the flea a vector. Listen to that word, vector. A vector is an organism that does not cause disease itself, but spreads infection by conveying pathogens from one host to another. Once inside the human bloodstream, the bacteria launched a brutal assault. The most common form was the bubonic plague. It targeted the lymphatic system. Within days, victims would develop painful, egg-sized swellings in their armpits, necks, or groins. These swellings were called buboes, which gives the plague its name. The speed of the infection was terrifying. A person could wake up feeling healthy, develop a fever by midday, show the dreaded swellings by evening, and be dead within 48 hours. These physical manifestations are what we call symptoms. A symptom is a physical or mental feature that indicates a disease. But biology soon turned even darker. If the bacteria reached the lungs, it became pneumonic plague. This form was highly contagious. It could be spread through the air by a simple cough or sneeze. Suddenly, you didn't need rats or fleas. You just needed a crowded room. This is where the biological reality clashed with the social reality of the 1300s. Medieval people lived in incredibly close quarters. Families often slept in one room, sometimes one bed. Cities were dense mazes of narrow alleys where sunlight rarely reached the ground. It was the perfect environment for contagion. Contagion means the communication of disease from one person to another by close contact. The spread was relentless. From Sicily, it hit Marseille in France, then Spain, then north to Paris, and across the Channel to London by 1348. It moved along the trade routes like a shadow following commerce. The very networks that had built medieval prosperity were now highways for death. The human reaction was immediate, primal panic. Chroniclers of the time, like the Italian writer Boccaccio, described horrifying scenes. The bonds of society simply snapped. Parents abandoned sick children. Husbands fled from wives. Priests, terrified of contagion, refused to perform last rites for the dying. The sick were often walled up in their homes and left to their fate. It was a total moral and social collapse. The biology of the disease, its speed, its painful symptoms, its invisible transmission, created a psychology of terror that paralyzed the continent. But why was this specific pandemic so devastating? Humanity had faced plagues before. Why did this one kill perhaps 40% to 50% of Europe's population in just 4 years? The answer lies not just in the bacteria, but in the state of Europe itself, right before the ships arrived. The continent was weaker than anyone realized. The plague was a spark, but Europe in the mid-1300s was tinder dry. The disaster did not begin in 1347. The foundations were laid decades earlier. To understand why the death toll was so catastrophic, wiping out perhaps half the continent, we must rewind the clock. We need to look away from the docks and look instead at the fields of northern Europe, 30 years before the Genoese ships arrived. The early 13th century were disastrous. The medieval warm period, which had allowed population growth, had ended. The climate cooled significantly. In the spring of 1315, rains began that seemed never to stop. Across England, France, and Germany, crops rotted in muddy fields. The harvest failed completely. Then it failed again the next year. This triggered the Great Famine. For several years, millions faced severe shortage. In historical terms, we call this a crisis of subsistence. Listen for this word, subsistence. It means the state of having just enough food or resources to stay alive, with absolutely nothing extra. Even those who did not die of outright starvation, a severe lack of food leading to death, suffered from chronic malnutrition. This is a condition where the body never gets the right nutrients to be healthy. A generation grew up stunted and weak. Their bodies were fighting a losing battle just to stay alive. This is the crucial context. When the Yersinia pestis bacteria arrived decades later, it did not attack a healthy population. It attacked a population whose immune systems were already compromised. They were biologically vulnerable. Let's define that. Vulnerability is the state of being exposed to the possibility of being attacked or harmed. Furthermore, as we mentioned in Part 1, the population density was critically high. Europe was full. When the plague hit, it tore through this weakened, overcrowded society like wildfire through dry wood. The death counts are difficult for modern minds to comprehend. Whole villages were erased from the map. In major cities like Florence or Paris, perhaps 60% of the residents died in a matter of months. There were not enough living to bury the dead. Pope Clement VI, desperate to save souls, consecrated the entire Rhone River at Avignon, so that corpses flung into it could be considered doomed to a Christian burial. It was a scene of unimaginable trauma. But then, something incredible happened. The dying stopped. The wave passed. The survivors crawled out of their shuttered homes. They looked around at a silent world. The immediate terror was over. Now began the slow realization of what had changed. We have synthesized the biological cause and the pre-existing social weaknesses. Now we must pivot to the consequences. Imagine you are a surviving peasant farmhand in England in 1350. You have lost half your family. You are traumatized. But you walk into the fields and realize something profound. There are half as many people to do the work, but there is just as much land. For centuries, land was scarce and labor was cheap. A lord could pay a peasant pennies because there were 10 others waiting for the job. Overnight, the fundamental economic equation of Europe had flipped. This is the beginning of a massive labor shift. The survivors suddenly found themselves with something they had never had before: leverage. How would they use it? And how would the powerful lords react when their cheap workforce demanded more? The battle for the post-plague economy was about to begin. The silence in the fields of Europe in 1350 was deceptive. It wasn't peace. It was the calm before a new kind of storm. This storm was economic. Before the plague, a feudal lord held all the cards. He owned the land. He had a surplus of peasants desperate to farm it in exchange for protection and a meager existence. It was a buyer's market for labor. But after the plague, the market flipped violently. Imagine you are a lord in rural France. Half your workforce is gone. The harvest is ripe in the field, rotting on the stalk. You need workers desperately. Suddenly, the surviving peasant, who a year ago begged for a crust of bread, is looking you in the eye and asking for higher wages. If you refuse, he will simply walk to the next estate, where another desperate lord will pay. This is a perfect example of supply and demand. Let's master this core English concept. When the supply, the number of available workers, crashes, and the demand, the need for their work, stays high, the value of that labor must increase. Wages for agricultural workers and artisans in towns skyrocketed. In some places, they doubled or even tripled within a few years. The response from the ruling classes was furious. They could not accept this new reality. They saw it not as economics, but as moral chaos. In England, the king passed the Statute of Labourers in 1351. This law was a desperate attempt to turn back the clock. It made it illegal for anyone to demand wages higher than pre-plague levels. It also made it illegal for lords to pay them. They tried to use the law to freeze the economy in time. This is our accidental twist for this part. The twist is that the law failed completely. The economic reality was stronger than the king's decree. Lords were forced to break the law and pay higher wages just to get their crops brought in. They competed against each other for workers. This failure demonstrates a crucial shift. The old feudal system, based on rigid hierarchy and cheap labor, was cracking. This period saw the rise of what historians call social mobility. Social mobility is the ability of individuals or families to move up or down the social ladder. For the first time in centuries, a peasant could accumulate a little wealth. They could buy better food, better clothes. They could rent more land. A new class of wealthier peasant, sometimes called the yeoman farmer, began to emerge. They were far from rich, but they were no longer starving serfs. This economic confidence led to a new sense of self-worth. People who had once accepted their lot in life as God's will began to question the authority of their masters. These tensions simmered for decades. The lords tried again and again to reassert their control, often through new taxes to recoup their lost wealth. Eventually, the pressure became too much. The simmering tension boiled over into open rebellion. We will see how this economic newfound confidence led to violent explosions that shook the very foundations of medieval power. The economic tension was like a tightly coiled spring. The lords pulled one way, trying to enforce the old rules. The newly confident laborers pulled the other, demanding their worth. Something had to give. The break came in a series of violent eruptions across Europe, often decades after the initial plague wave. These were not random riots. They were organized, angry, and politically motivated rebellions. We are witnessing a profound shift, economic leverage transforming into political action. In France, in 1358, it was the Jacquerie, a brutal, spontaneous uprising of peasants who felt crushed by both tax-hungry nobles and the devastation of the 100 Years' War. But the clearest example of this new political confidence happened in England in 1381. The Peasants' Revolt. The trigger was yet another new tax, a poll tax, that hit the poor hardest. But the underlying cause was the post-plague reality. The people were no longer willing to be treated as serfs. Led by figures like Wat Tyler and the radical priest John Ball, thousands of commoners marched on London. They didn't just want lower taxes, they had revolutionary demands. John Ball famously preached a radical message of equality. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? This translates to, when Adam dug the earth and Eve spun wool at the beginning of time, there were no lords or masters. They demanded an end to serfdom entirely. They wanted a fixed rent for land, not arbitrary labor service to a lord. For a few terrifying days, these peasants controlled London. They burned the palaces of hated officials and even captured the Tower of London. The young king, Richard II, was forced to meet them. He faced a mass of armed commoners who looked their monarch in the eye and demanded their freedom. Ultimately, the revolt was crushed. Wat Tyler was killed during a meeting with the king. The promises made by Richard II were immediately broken. The leaders were hunted down and executed. While the revolt failed, it proved that the old feudal order was shattered beyond repair. The psychological barrier was gone. The elites knew they could no longer simply command and expect obedience. Serfdom in England slowly withered away over the next century. It wasn't abolished by a single law. It became economically unsustainable and politically dangerous to enforce. The plague had broken the chains of serfdom, not with kindness, but with brutal economic reality. So, we have seen how labor shifts led to social mobility and political upheaval in the countryside. But the story is not just rural. The plague also emptied the great cities of Europe. Now we must return to those silent streets to see how they began to rebuild. The urban rebirth was about to begin, and it would look very different from the cramped medieval city that had been so vulnerable to infection. We have explored the fields and the uprisings. Now we return to the cities, where the plague had first arrived. Imagine a city like London or Florence in the immediate aftermath. It is a ghost town. Whole neighborhoods are abandoned. Shops are shuttered. The silence is profound. But cities are resilient organisms. Nature abhors a vacuum, and so does urban life. With half the population gone, a strange new phenomenon occurred within the city walls. Before the plague, space was incredibly scarce. Rent was high. People lived packed together like sardines. Suddenly, there was space. Empty houses stood waiting. Survivors from the countryside, fleeing the chaos of the post-plague manners, flooded into the towns. They were looking for work, yes, but also for a new start. Urbanization is the process by which large numbers of people become permanently concentrated in relatively small areas, forming cities. These new urban residents found a very different landscape. The desperate competition for housing was gone. Rents crashed. A skilled artisan, a carpenter, a weaver, a blacksmith, could now afford to rent a larger house. They could perhaps even rent a shop of their own instead of working for a master. Just as wages rose in the countryside, the value of skilled labor soared in the city. This led to a significant change in the standard of living. We see this clearly in the archaeological record. Before the plague, the average person's diet was mostly bread and thin pottage, a vegetable soup. Meat was a rare luxury for feasts. After the plague, with higher wages and lower grain prices, since there were fewer mouths to feed, regular people began to eat better. They consumed more meat, more cheese, more ale. They bought better clothing. They began to purchase small luxuries that had previously been out of reach, perhaps a pewter plate instead of wood, or a better quality wool tunic. This burgeoning consumer demand kick-started the urban economy. It was a golden age for the artisan. The guild system, which had tightly controlled trade, found itself having to adapt to this new, ambitious workforce. But this urban rebirth wasn't just economic. The trauma of the plague had left a deep psychological scar that manifested in the physical fabric of the city. People remembered the stench, the bodies piled in the streets, the terrifying speed of the contagion. They began to make the connection between filth and disease. The old medieval attitude of laissez-faire toward sanitation began to shift. Public health refers to the science and art of preventing disease, prolonging life, and promoting health through the organized efforts of society. In the wake of the plague, city councils across Europe began to pass new, strict regulations. They passed laws against butchering animals in the street. They mandated that trash be removed from the city limits. They tried to regulate where human waste could be dumped. The most significant innovation was the invention of the quarantine. The word itself comes from the Italian 40 giorni, meaning 40 days. This was the period ships arriving from plague-infected ports were forced to wait at anchor before anyone could disembark. It was a brutal, blunt instrument, but it showed a new way of thinking. It was a rational, organized attempt by the state to control a biological threat. The city was no longer just a collection of houses. It was a managed environment. But as the physical city was being cleaned and reordered, the spiritual city was in turmoil. The church, the absolute center of medieval life, had failed spectacularly during the crisis. It had not been able to stop the plague, and many of its priests had fled in fear. The survivors were left with profound, agonizing questions. If God was good, why did this happen? If the church was God's representative on earth, why was it so powerless? These questions would lead to a spiritual revolution that would eventually shatter the unity of Western Christendom. The city streets were being cleaned, but the spiritual mess was far harder to address. The Catholic Church in the 1300s was not just a religious institution. It was the foundation of reality. It held the keys to heaven. It explained the world. When the plague arrived, people naturally turned to the church for salvation. They prayed. They went on processions. They bought indulgences. And they still died in the millions. The psychological trauma of this failure cannot be overstated. It created a profound spiritual crisis. For many, the conclusion was obvious. God was furiously angry with humanity. The plague was a divine punishment for their sins. This belief fueled a wave of intense, almost manic religious fervor. The most dramatic example was the flagellant movement. These were groups of men, and sometimes women, who marched from town to town, whipping themselves with scourges tipped with iron spikes. They did this to perform public penance, hoping to appease God's wrath and stop the plague. It was a terrifying spectacle of blood and religious ecstasy. But this was a desperate, backward-looking reaction. A more profound, forward-looking shift was also happening. Many people began to look for a more personal connection to God, one that did not rely on the corrupted, ineffective hierarchy of the church structure. Mysticism flourished. Lay people began to read religious texts in their own languages, not just Latin. They formed religious confraternities distinct from the official church. This was the sowing of seeds for the Reformation that would erupt a century later. We are synthesizing here. The failure of institutions during the crisis led to a questioning of their authority. But there was another, darker response to this spiritual terror. In the face of incomprehensible disaster, human societies often look for a scapegoat. A scapegoat is a person or group who is unfairly blamed for something that others have done or for some misfortune. Tragically, in many parts of Europe, the scapegoats were the Jewish communities. A horrifying conspiracy theory spread that Jews were poisoning the wells to cause the plague. This lie, fueled by centuries of anti-Semitism and the desperate panic of the moment, led to horrific pogroms. In cities like Strasbourg, Basel, and many others across the Holy Roman Empire, entire Jewish communities were rounded up and burned alive. Thousands were murdered by mobs who believed that by killing the outsider, they could save themselves from the disease. It is a stark reminder of how quickly terror can turn into atrocity. So, we see a fracturing of the medieval mind. On one side, intense religious fervor and a search for scapegoats. On the other, a quiet, growing skepticism about established authority. The church had survived, but its monopoly on truth was cracked. These spiritual tremors were happening alongside the economic earthquakes in the countryside and the cities. The old world was breaking apart. The feudal system was crumbling. The unquestioned authority of the church was waning. The stage was being cleared for something new. In the next part, we will pull all these threads together to see how this perfect storm of biology, economics, and faith created the conditions for the Renaissance. We are now ready to synthesize the pieces. We have seen how the plague, the biological trigger, set off a chain reaction. It empowered labor in the fields, leading to the end of serfdom. It enriched the surviving urban artisans, creating a new class of consumers. It forced cities to organize and invent public health, creating a stronger, more interventionist state. It shattered the unquestioned spiritual authority of the church, leading to new, personal forms of faith and skepticism. Now, we must connect these to the grandest transformation of all, the shift from the Middle Ages to the modern era. Historians debate the exact causes of the Renaissance, that blossoming of art, culture, and science that began in Italy. But many argue that the post-plague landscape was the essential soil in which it grew. Consider the wealthy merchants of Florence. Families like the Medici. Before the plague, their wealth might have gone into traditional land ownership or donations to the church. But after the plague, the world felt more precarious. Life was short. There was a new urgency to leave a mark now, in this world, not just wait for the next. They became patrons of the arts on an unprecedented scale. They used their wealth generated in the new, more dynamic post-plague economy, to commission paintings, sculptures, and magnificent buildings. And who were the artists they hired? They were the descendants of those artisan classes who had seen their status and wealth rise after the pestilence. Men like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Raphael. They were not humble medieval craftsmen anonymous in their guilds. They were individual superstars, confident in their own genius. This new confidence in human potential, what we call humanism, was a direct counter-narrative to the medieval obsession with sin and death. Humanism is a rationalist outlook, or system of thought, attaching prime importance to human rather than divine or supernatural matters. The plague had shown the horrifying reality of death. The Renaissance was a defiant celebration of life. Furthermore, the crisis had spurred a new kind of practical questioning. The old medical textbooks had failed. The old prayers had not worked. This failure encouraged a new empirical spirit. Men began to look at the world not through ancient texts, but through their own eyes. Doctors began to perform dissections more freely, desperate to understand the human body. Navigators pushed further out to sea, seeking new trade routes that weren't dependent on the old, plague-ridden paths from the east. This would eventually lead to the age of exploration. The state, now more powerful and organized after its experiments with public health, began to centralize its power, laying the groundwork for the modern nation-state. Every aspect of what we consider modernity has a root that can be traced back to the trauma and subsequent reordering of the post-plague world. The catastrophe was the crucible. It burned away the rigid structures of the High Middle Ages and left behind a more fluid, more questioning, more individualistic society. It was a horrific price to pay for progress. But history is rarely gentle. We are almost at the end of our journey. We have traced the path from the rat flea to the Renaissance masterpiece. In the final part, we will summarize this grand historical arc and offer some final reflections on how a biological accident reshaped human destiny. Let us step back and look at the panorama we have painted. We began in the crowded, vulnerable world of the early 1300s. A world teetering on the edge of Malthusian crisis, where population had outstripped resources. Malthusian refers to the theory that population tends to increase at a faster rate than its means of subsistence, unless checked by moral restraint or disaster. We saw the biological trigger, the arrival of Yersinia pestis, an invisible killer that exploited Europe's very strengths, its trade networks and dense cities. We witnessed the immediate horror, the collapse of social norms, and the unfathomable death toll that wiped out perhaps half the continent. Then we synthesized the long-term consequences. We saw the economic inversion, the rise of labor power, the end of serfdom, and the birth of a wealthier, more assertive peasantry and artisan class. We saw the urban rebirth, cities rebuilding with a new focus on sanitation and order, giving birth to the concept of public health and the interventionist state. We saw the spiritual crisis, the cracking of the Church's absolute authority, leading to both fanatical extremism and the quiet, personal search for truth that paved the way for the Reformation. And finally, we connected all these threads to the cultural explosion of the Renaissance, a defiant celebration of human potential born from the ashes of mass death. This narrative is a powerful example of historical synthesis. It demonstrates that history is not just one damn thing after another. It is a complex web of causality. A biological event creates an economic crisis. The economic crisis triggers political and social upheaval. The social upheaval leads to a cultural and spiritual revolution. To understand the modern Western world, its focus on the individual, its capitalist economy, its secular states, its belief in progress, you cannot ignore the shadow of the Black Death. It was the violent birth pang of modernity. Of course, we must be careful with historical parallels. We should not oversimplify. The plague did not cause the Renaissance in a simple, direct way. History is too complex for that. Historians debate the relative importance of these factors. Some argue that the feudal system was already cracking before the plague. Others suggest the cultural shifts of the Renaissance had other, independent roots. But the evidence is overwhelming that the Great Mortality acted as a massive accelerant. It kicked down doors that were already creaking open. It is a sobering lesson. It suggests that major historical change is often not the result of gradual, peaceful evolution. Often it requires a massive external shock to break the existing structures and force a society to adapt. The story of the late Middle Ages is a story of incredible resilience. It is the story of how humanity, faced with an existential threat, not only survived, but reinvented itself. The silent streets of 1350 did not remain silent forever. They filled with new life, new ideas, and new ambition. As we conclude, think about the world today. We too face global challenges that seem insurmountable. We too live in highly interconnected, vulnerable systems. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. The story of the Great Mortality is not just a history lesson. It is a mirror for any society facing a crisis. It teaches us that the most profound changes often come from the most unexpected directions. A flea on a rat can be more consequential than a king on a throne. It teaches us that resilience is not just about bouncing back to the way things were. It is about adapting, evolving, and building something new out of the wreckage. The Europe that emerged in 1500 was vastly different from the Europe of 1300. It was wealthier per capita, more socially fluid, more urban, more questioning, and more globally ambitious. It had paid a horrific price in human suffering to get there. The trauma of those years was burned into the cultural memory for centuries. The image of the danse macabre, the dance of death, where skeletons lead popes, emperors, and peasants alike to the grave, became a ubiquitous motif in art. It was a grim reminder of the ultimate equality of death, a lesson the plague had taught with brutal clarity. But alongside the dance of death, there was now the art of the Renaissance, celebrating the beauty of the human form and the power of the human mind. This is the central paradox we must hold. The greatest catastrophe in European history was also the catalyst for its greatest cultural flowering. For you, the English learner, this story offers a rich vocabulary for discussing cause and effect, systemic change, and human resilience. Words like vector, synthesis, demographic shift, urbanization, scapegoat, and humanism are powerful tools for understanding not just history, but the complex world we live in today. Practicing how to connect these concepts into coherent arguments, how to link the micro level of biology to the macro level of society, is a hallmark of advanced language proficiency. So, the next time you look at a Renaissance painting, or read about the rise of the modern state, remember the silent ships arriving in Messina in 1347. Remember the terrified people who did not know what was happening to them. And remember how their descendants, against all odds, built a new world from the ashes of the old. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into the London Gritty Chronicles.